Hi, I'm here today with Miriam Iorwerth. She's the Digital Development Manager at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland, and before that, she was lecturing in music at the University of the Highlands, which is very, very interesting to me, specialising to music technology and online music collaboration, network music. She has a PhD on how musicians experience network music performance, and before her career in academia was working at the Halley Research Station in Antarctica. So, wow, Antarctica, that's a really long distance away. And I'd just like to ask you, how did it feel to be so far away from the world and truly isolated? Did you think about music and network music?
Oh, wow, great question. Yeah, how did... Well, I suppose I was very young when I went. I was 23 when I went, so I think I had the ignorance of youth, perhaps. So it just felt like a really, really huge adventure. And in terms of isolation, I worked on a radar. My job was looking after this radar that looked at the upper atmosphere, aurora type things. I've kind of forgotten a lot of the science of it, but I used to sit by this radar, so it looked out to the South Pole, and there was basically nothing between the radar. That was like the furthest bit south of the base, I think, if I remember correctly. I would sit there and look and go, there's not a single thing. Nothing. There's nothing between here and the South Pole, where there's actually quite a big population of people. So that really, I used to have these moments of, reflection, I suppose. And yeah, I do actually think it does come up sometimes when I'm thinking about network music, because I think of the fact that actually it's not that difficult. I suppose that's the big thing. When I was in Antarctica, so what year was that? 2005. I was there for the winter, and that was the first year that the internet had been kind of put into the base. So I suppose that was actually the starting point of me realizing that technology could connect us so easily. We used to have these monthly meetings with our managers. They were back in Cambridge. That was where the base was, and it just kind of tickles me sometimes when there's this conversation about remote working and how it doesn't really work very well. And you think, well, my boss was like 10,000 miles away, and I mean there was a huge delay, but it worked fine. Yeah, so I think there is a connection there. Definitely, probably part of my psyche or something.
Oh, it's fantastic. So, having come from a technical background, thinking about how when we engage with network music, we are suddenly assuming the identity of not just a musician, but also a technician and a sound engineer. So, I'd love to hear about your journey and how other musicians might be encouraged to taking on a network project if they're not already integrating technology to their practice.
Yeah, I suppose actually I never, in terms of identity as a musician, when I was at college, I actually didn't study music to start with. I was studying chemistry and maths and physics, and I wanted to be a doctor. And then I actually absolutely hated chemistry with a fiery passion. And so instead of dropping out completely, my very wise chemistry teacher said, well, what do you actually like doing? I was like, well, music, obviously, but I'm not a musician. I've never seen myself as a performer. I've always had that kind of unfortunate sort of, oh, I'm not good enough thing in terms of the actual performance. But as an educator, obviously, I see things slightly differently now, and I kind of really believe that if you can make a sound and you want to, then you're a musician. So that's changed a lot. So in terms of my journey, I suppose I've always been the facilitator. I felt like the facilitator of music rather than a performer, although I do perform. So that might be in terms of organising concerts or the teaching side of things. But in terms of technology, facilitating people to do things like networked music. But actually, there's such a spectrum of technology around this that if you can do a video call like we're doing now, which you can fairly easily do on your phone through WhatsApp or whatever particular platform you want to use, then you can do networked music. And I think that's probably the message that I would give to somebody, is that, yeah, there is a huge spectrum. It's not all highly technical. It's much more about the connection. It's about the networking in the wider sense rather than the computer sense. That's the important bit. So, yes, you can do it in a highly technical way, but actually you can also do it in a really straightforward way. And obviously that's then interconnected with the music that you play and how you approach it. And I would say probably if you're doing it in a really kind of low-tech version, then you probably need to think a bit more about the music and how you kind of approach that than maybe you would if you were using a really high-tech version. Although maybe not, I don't know. I think there's a balance between those. What's your perspective around that? Because
well, I want to follow up with another question because, I'm full of questions. I've been doing, network music for, gosh, a long time. Almost a decade, like as a professional focus. Before that, working with the technology that I then started using with music for, long distance recording tech. But I'm still interested in the question, why are musicians looking at these tools and going, it's not for me, it doesn't work, there's a barrier still. And I really believe it's cultural. I believe they're not seeing other people doing it in mainstream technology, and I believe there's going to be a breakthrough at some point. My theory, I still stick with this, somewhere there's a pair of 15-year-olds, really cool young kids, and they've got a band, maybe hip hop and some mix of, these days it's all fusion of everything. And then their parents are like, I'm sorry, but we're moving states. And so they're being separated, and they're like, well, damn it, I'm going to keep working together. And they'll just make it work, and then they'll make a hit record, and that will be it, and the whole world will start making network music. It needs a moment.
But I think maybe it's partly to do with sort of gatekeeping in music, isn't it, as well? It's what there's a lot of people who like to say what music is and what music isn't, and I think maybe that's possibly a barrier, especially maybe for people who haven't grown up with technology at school in terms of music technology. That it's certainly music education has evolved, hasn't it, quite a lot in the last, the entire history of music education has evolved, but where technology is coming into the classroom, and maybe has in the last, say, 20 years or so, I wonder whether that will help in terms of the fear factor maybe, and also the acceptance of technology as music and in music, rather than it being a separate thing, that's what the specialists do maybe.
Yeah, there's another tangent to that too, and as an educator, you'll also have seen this, is that when you're working with students, their idea of what music is irrelevant to what we care about. As a teacher, you don't grade on whether you like it or not. You grade it on other criteria, and so you really get exposed to what they think music is. And I love that, even 20 years later, another generation, what their idea of music is very different to what mine was. And I love that so much. So that's where I have that hope.
Yeah. And I suppose also it's about, as you say, exposure. And if we can expose our students to these different approaches, because it's not a different type of music or even a different way of playing. It's just an approach and a sort of the way you think about music, the way you think about time, for example, in music. I'm a percussionist, and so that idea of time and rhythm is so completely, excuse the pun, but drummed into you, then taking that away from or kind of maybe slightly separating that from your idea of what ensemble music is, I think is probably maybe one of the stumbling blocks. Anyway, if you've been taught that ensemble means playing exactly in time with one another, then to kind of shift away from that it's nothing to do with technology, is it? It's to do with the music itself.
Exactly. No, I mean, didn't jazz go through that as well? If you look back 100 years ago, I'm sure there were people going, that weird jazz thing, they're not even in time with each other. I swear it must have happened to, many listeners who were thinking, 4/4 on the beat. Yeah,
have you heard of, I completely forget the actual technical name of it, but psalm singing in the Hebrides?
Oh my God, yes. That is the best. Please explain it, because you'll do a better job than me.
Well, I won't, I'm not deeply engaged in that culture, so I feel like I'm kind of speaking on behalf of other people, but it's, I believe it's in the Free Church of Scotland. I might have to check that. But so it's where the minister, I hope I get this right, the minister sings a phrase, one of the psalms, and the congregation sing it back, but with their own kind of idea of how it sounds, so kind of improvisatory. So it becomes a sort of merging of lots of different voices, but they're not particularly necessarily in time with one another. They're not singing exactly the same thing. So it's this overall kind of sound that's ensemble, but not in terms of the timing and the tuning and all of those things that we expect. So it has this very kind of ethereal kind of sound to it.
Yeah. So the good news is, I researched this maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and there is a very short documentary of a couple of minutes somewhere, hopefully still on the internet. So I'm going to look for that and post it along with this interview here, because I think anyone listening, go and listen to it. It's something beautiful about it. How, like you said, people are just going, I'm responding to the minister, but I'm not trying to stay in time with everyone around me. I may sing differently, I may sing it longer or shorter, and this is a really, really special thing, I think, that we can learn from.
Funnily enough, the very first time I heard that was in, I studied at the University of Surrey for my first degree. I don't think I'd even been to Scotland at that point. And it was a lecture called Music in Other Cultures, and it was played to us, and the question was, where does this come from? And we were like, wow, I've never heard anything like that before. I mean, I had absolutely no idea. And then when the lecturer said, oh, it's actually in the Hebrides in Scotland, basically in your country, in the UK, we were like absolutely blown away by it. Yeah,
it's really special. And, there's many cultures where they treat timing differently than in Western classical music or pop music as well, and seeing the rise of African music increasingly popular. There's many complex rhythms, which is another thing we know with network music. If you want complexity, do it over the internet, because you'll not sync up, and you'll create this great syncopation without even trying.
And that's okay, isn't it? I think that's the big message, is that's great, that's interesting. I always think it also makes me think of the music of Steve Reich as well, that whole idea of the phasing, like violin phase, for example, where the two musicians are actually trying to not be in time with one another. What an enormous skill
hard
that
to do,
is. Yeah.
Right? It's like, well, just put some internet delay on it, no problem. Does that detract from Steve Reich's work, or these are questions? If it's not such a challenge to do, is it then not interesting?
Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it? I actually love his music. And
yes.
Yeah, music for pieces of wood. I've done that a few times with students at varying levels of success, but it's that conversation that you have around it that it's about. So in that piece you have 5 sets of claves. You've got one who kind of keeps time, and then you've got patterns that are the same in 2 parts, and then out of phase by kind of one. I think it's one quaver with the others, but you repeat it the number of times until it feels right, and that's one of the really kind of interesting things about that piece, and explaining that to people and getting students to understand that you're not counting, you're not doing it a set number of times, you're doing it until it does this kind of settling thing.
And I love what you just said, until it feels right, because when we're playing music together, ultimately we're doing it to satisfy something inside us, our soul, our heart, our mind, our humanness. That it's a very, very, very satisfying feeling to play music together, to move in time together, to synchronize together, to arrive at the same point together. Something really profound happens to you as a human being when you do that, and we can all do it in large groups. Everyone's had the opportunity to be a large choir when they're in school. We've all had that feeling. So just, anyone who's not a musician listening to this, just extrapolate on that, how much more we're doing that as when you're maybe in an ensemble or a professional ensemble, you're just doing that, more of that. But I believe that's, to me, why network music really excites me, is that I can be online together with the people I care about, and I can make music with them, and then make that relationship more profound. But I'm just going to case in point on that, you and I have not met in person, but we spent a lot of time together on video chats or emails or projects, and then so we've built a friendship, And we'll get to meet early next year, which is great. I'm finally getting to Scotland. And then we will foment that relationship. It's not, to me, it's just going to be like, another moment in our relationship time that we will then keep building on remotely. So I'm wondering if you have other experience or thoughts on this about how network music forms and enhances relationships.
Yeah, and I think the biggest example of that I have is from the teaching that I was doing. So at the University of the Highlands and Islands, that music course that I was teaching on it's not completely remote. We did have residencies where people get together kind of 2 weeks out of the year. But for the majority of it, the students are working apart and they're working on musical projects together. And they're doing their studies. So potentially over 4 years, and in fact it was different over COVID when we couldn't do the residencies. I'd have to work it out, but I think there were years where they probably had 4 weeks in total together in the place together. But they still formed these relationships as musicians, as students, and the friendships just blossomed. And I remember, I think in fact it was the first residency after COVID when we could all get back together. It was just this sort of amazing, slightly strange situation where, like, especially as lecturers and with the students, we felt like we knew them, but then suddenly there was the physicality as well. And it's not that we didn't know them, it's just then we suddenly knew them in a different way. So I think that has made it really clear to me how you can work together and form these relationships. And these relationships are really important in terms of the music as well. The musical relationships, the personal relationships, the professional relationships, I think they can all be built up online, and they can be continued online. And I don't. It's sort of that idea again of it's not just one or the other. It's the combination. And I suppose this goes actually back to the Antarctic thing. I have friends from all over the world, and several of my local friends have kind of commented of how isn't it amazing how you keep those friendships going. And again, it might be that I never see them for like 10 years, but I still feel like there's that connection. So yeah, for me, it's not a separate thing or in fact, it's not really different in any way. It's just part of the relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's another benefit of network music, which is overcoming geography, which me being from New Zealand, that's another mutual area for us, given, the experiences we've had from working long distance. And accessibility also means inclusivity for other reasons, for example, disability, people caring for families, visas and immigration statuses. Where else are you seeing accessibility being important?
Yeah, in fact, the geographical aspect of it, that's why I started doing this, because I was living up in Fort William and the students were all over the place in Scotland and beyond. And so, yeah, it was purely a practical way, actually, to get people together in terms of the music. So, and that's kind of, I think, again, I suppose it's about me reflecting on it and learning from it and realising that is much, much wider than that. And COVID probably was a good example of that, where everybody was suddenly isolated. So that in some ways kind of opened people's minds up to the fact that there are people who are isolated all the time for those reasons that you mentioned. Conflict's another one of them. So yeah, maybe we're a bit more open now to understanding that. Although on the flip side, I think there's been this kind of thing about COVID, it's all over now, so we can just go back to normal. And I think it'd be a real shame if we lose that idea of accessibility and inclusion.
Well, we're not at remote work, so we just need to keep pushing with the music stuff. But many people are happy that they can have, 2-3 days at home working now. That's not going away. So, yeah. Another question to that too is, of course, the environment. So, one area where remote work has such an impact, it's absolutely no question that it's better for the environment to work remotely. According to a study done a couple of years ago by a European agency, every hour of a remote call, so 1 hour of a remote call between two people, so what we're using now, is 2.5% of the carbon use of 1 kilometre of driving a combustible engine car. I mean, it's nuts. Just this huge, the difference is just absolutely nuts. Though I don't hear this a lot in the network music community. Maybe it's something where for example, did we start thinking about network music well before the pandemic, before the climate change really became such a big thing? Or I don't know. There've been some interesting projects though. Is there anything that you've seen musicians talking about the environment as well in regards to network music?
Do you know what? I haven't at all, and it's almost a bit of a blind spot, isn't it? I think for musicians potentially that perhaps musicians as a whole, maybe if you're not thinking from the network perspective, if you've been doing physical performances in spaces, then there's this sense of, oh, well, I have to do that. I have to travel to continue my profession. So maybe that's an educational thing as well, that we should be shouting about it much louder, that actually the environmental impact of what people do and how they perform and rehearsals as well. It's like I see, again, kind of going back to that idea of that it's not all or nothing. If we can, or if musicians can maybe reduce their impact by, say, having one rehearsal online, for example, that they wouldn't have done otherwise,
yes.
It can be a kind of, a little step in the right direction, perhaps, and then maybe going, actually, no, this does work, and actually it's saved me loads of time. I've not had to travel halfway around the world, or for those in Scotland, drive down the A9 for 3 hours, or whatever it happens to be. But I think, maybe we should be shouting more about that.
Yeah. I did a project many years ago when Source Connect was very young. A school in Virginia in the US had been doing a regular yearly project with another jazz school in Durban in South Africa, where they would swap every year. The students would go to Virginia or the students would go to Durban. When this teacher, very advanced thinking, was like, oh my God, I can use this tool so that my students can get to know each other before they travel. And then when they're there, they'll already have an idea of who they're playing with, and we'll maximize the time together. It was very special and very, very early thinking. I was impressed by that.
Yeah, and actually that's a good point, because if you think about all rehearsal, depending on genre and style and all those kind of things, a lot of time in rehearsal spent chatting, isn't it? Getting to know people and building those relationships.
Exactly. Going out for a beer, all of those.
Yeah. Which I would never say don't do, but if we can be more efficient in the time that we do have together, then surely that's a good thing, I suppose, from the musical point of view. We can do more of that musical development in that time. Yeah,
absolutely. I also wonder whether, as musicians, we can say, look, I will start deciding to take trains, and take the slower way there, because the world's allowing us now to say, okay, I can leave my laptop on a train for 5 hours and I can work. And then it's okay that, these things, hopefully the world is making it easier for us to do slow travel and then make the best use of our time.
And actually there's loads of creative opportunities for that, aren't there, as well, around music and trains and the arts generally and trains. I think I read recently that it's actually illegal to play a musical instrument on a train in the UK unless you have permission.
Right, well, we know why they do that, because there's too many bad trumpet players out there that you have to suffer for. But maybe instead they need the certificate, like, yes, you've passed your grade 8 and you're in tune. No, I don't know. But speaking of that, the new creative possibilities, ultimately, above all, all that I love, the technology, and I love that it connects me remotely, and, all the environment, it makes new music. And this is what I love them above everything.
And it makes music that would be impossible in any other situation.
Yes.
I keep racking my brains to think whether it would be possible. I think technically we probably could find a way to create that delay somehow, but I think that would it wouldn't work with acoustic instruments.
You'd still need to be in different rooms.
Yeah.
And then, I'm not sure that the idea of artificially adding delay is relevant when we're just like, a wall away. To me, that's, I don't know, it's a thought experiment. It doesn't excite me. I don't know what it is in music that makes all things feel authentic, but faking network music is, I don't know, what's the point to me?
Yeah, absolutely. And funnily enough, when I did my PhD, I had to do that. So when I did the studies for it, I had people in 2 separate studios that were interconnected and was adding delay and things. And this was pre-COVID, so this was, I felt like actually looking back on it, I would do it in a totally different way. I would be much more creative. And I had this idea of that the only way that people would ever do this, because that was, when was that? 2013 I started it. The only way that I felt musicians would accept it was if it was really small groups, like pairs of people, and they were doing it for a very specific purpose. Because I worked with student musicians and some professionals across different genres, and that was kind of what they were saying to me. This was before most of them were exposed to it. They're like, oh, well, this is actually really hard. And so there's this line somewhere in my thesis, and I regret it, basically saying that the only network music performance that professionals are going to accept is when there's minimal latency, and it's just like playing in a room together. And that's just wrong. Can I take that back?
That's wrong. Yeah. Yeah. I did one similar piece in just before the pandemic as well. I had two ensembles playing in different rooms, and they were separated by a short corridor. So if you're in one room, you heard that group. And if you're in the other room, you heard the other group. They were connected over Wi-Fi and playing together. And I had a score that was generative score that was using machine learning that would say, if you guys are playing the same thing, then, advance the score or something. So they had to listen to each other. But then the audience, I said, look, get up and walk around. Stand in the middle if you want. So if you stood in the corridor, you could hear both. And so I used that opportunity to create a new space. And it kind of happened by accident because of the situation. But it inspired me a lot.
Yeah, actually that does make me think also I suppose my thesis kind of rested on the fact that people would be doing this for rehearsal, and that there wasn't an element of performance, presentation of it, and I didn't take into account audience at all. Like I just ignored that. And it's like, that's.
Well, yeah, I mean, of course, as analog musicians, I suppose that you just say in real life, even if you're playing digital instruments, we're still analog. We're used to being in the same room at the same time, and the audience is used to being with us, And so then we're the visual element, we're the physicality, that whatever happens when you're in the same room with someone. I'm not a scientist on that level, but I'm sure something neurological happens. Maybe we smell each other. I don't know. But even digital music changed that. And I remember in the 90s how, the conversations we had about how uninteresting it was to watch somebody on their laptop. So, but technology's changed a lot. And now you see musicians using interfaces. So, you are seeing them move. Do we need to see them move? Is that what it is? I mean, I'm seeing some interesting projects like interactive tactiles and dance. And what are your approaches regarding physicality and visual engagement to music so the audience can also engage?
Yeah, well, I suppose the first thing that springs to mind is that music is an oral phenomenon. And if you can't see, are you losing anything? So if you have a disability that affects your sight, does that affect your ability to enjoy and kind of engage with music? I don't think I'm the right person to answer that, but I think that's my first kind of thought around that. And then I also think about just going back to the laptop thing, the idea of algo rave. I love that idea, where it's live coding on a laptop, and actually the most physicality that anybody's actually doing, because their minds are going really fast as they're trying to kind of live code the things that they're imagining. Their fingers are moving, and that's about it. But they
right.
think about this by projecting the code up onto a screen.
Yes.
So that's the visual aspect. So you can actually see the process.
Right.
You can.
Yeah. So we can participate in their mind process.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you can see, what I love about it is you see someone type something and then they go, no, actually, I'll just delete that and start again. And that editing process, and that, I mean, it's massively geeky, isn't it? It's a really kind of, it's about as techie as you can get in terms of live performance in music, I think. But yeah, going back to the network side of things, in my book I talk about the video side of it. So when I was teaching this, even kind of through the pandemic, we never discussed video. Everything that everyone did was using audio. So that's what their assessments were and things. That would be the audio that they produced at the end. But I think COVID kind of made people think about the video. I don't know why. I don't know why that is. Do we like to, when we're engaged? Maybe it's because when we're engaging with computers, we like something to look at. Maybe that's what it is. But the thing that really struck me, kind of thinking about network music in its widest context, so the asynchronous idea where people are kind of building up music through files, like multi-tracking, but over a distance. I was always amazed at these little boxes that would appear on the screen, and it was like this was the aesthetic, the video aesthetic of that virtual ensemble thing. And I always wondered about that, because why do people automatically do that? Were they trying to sort of show that it was distance? Was the distance really important in it, even though you couldn't hear it, because there's no delay if you're working asynchronously? Because there's so many creative opportunities around video. I was just really surprised that was the kind of overarching aesthetic.
Yeah.
But yeah, from the live point of view, yeah, I think it's again that idea of the creative around the visual. There's loads of opportunities that don't necessarily involve seeing the musicians, and I think maybe that could be further exploited, maybe.
I think for sure, I mean, there's all the live film and live cinema movements. I don't know much about what's going on there with remote technologies. If there are people out there doing live remote theatre. I know I've seen, most of what I saw was during the pandemic. I saw some very, very successful pieces, some very successful dance pieces. I'm going to send links along with this as well, because there's some great stuff out there that whoever's watching or listening to this, I think you'll enjoy seeing those. But what I haven't seen, of course, there hasn't been anything on the grander stage. I'm not seeing any remote opera or any pop stars or rock stars or other than maybe the occasional someone being broadcast in to play a solo, but they're not playing together. And I hope that will change. Maybe it's just a matter of the technology getting stronger and people trusting it, or needing some influencer out there, some Hans Zimmer to make it happen, and then everybody goes, oh yeah, this is cool. And I don't know, maybe it's just time.
Video. I'm just thinking. Oh yeah, the other thing I was going to say around video was, again going back to my PhD. One thing I am pleased about around it was I looked at video in relation to the communication between the musicians, rather than from an audience perspective, and that was a really interesting thing, because the way that people perceived how they used the video, if that makes sense. So how if you ask them, did you use the video to communicate with you? Oh, yeah, absolutely, yes, I did. But then I did some kind of, it wasn't quite eye tracking, but it was looking at actually where people were looking frame by frame. And you could go through and you could see they barely looked at one another at all, but they felt that they needed to. So that was a really interesting thing, because actually when we're playing, we don't really look at one another. I'm trying to think, there was one time I was playing with a band on stage, and the only time that I really kind of intensely looked at somebody was when I'd lost my place and I was just looking at the keyboard player to work out what chord they're on. I'm like, oh, right, okay, there I am. But in terms, and the occasional glance and a smile, or if something goes wrong, you kind of like the grimace or whatever it is. But in terms of that ensemble playing, there isn't really a great need to look at one another. I think, but we as musicians, we believe that we do and that we need to. But maybe we don't.
Yeah. Maybe we like to. We very much like to be together. That's to go back to something I said when we opened. And so you could say, you could take a conductor of the orchestra, and you could give everybody fancy glasses that had the timing and some kind of shapes that told them where they were. But I bet everybody would be like, just give me the conductor, even though, because we're separating the person through technology in a way that it's not necessary. We maybe as humans we're very not easily scammed into thinking, this is not a substitute that I'm happy with. Is there anything there about, substitution?
Yeah, I think it's about I think from the visual point of view, it's about realizing that you're working with a human, because potentially if you didn't have the visual, you could just be working with, I don't know, AI. You could be working with a robot, couldn't you? You just wouldn't know. So maybe that's that idea of why we don't want that taken away. So that I know that I'm talking to you, Rebekah, because I can see your face and we can interact. Whereas if we did this by phone, I wonder, we'd still be very successful. But
it's eye contact. There's a thinker that is very important to me, Caroline Navion, and she talks about presence. How trust is a process that's developed by human presence. And so, the most form of trust is you, me, here together in the same time. And then as you take away those layers, so for example, you and I at the same time, but separated by distance. Okay, that's only 1 degree away. At least we're in the same time and I'm talking to you and I'm not separate. There's not these substitutions. But as we substitute more and more and more, so maybe you wrote a book 200 years ago and I'm reading it, then I'm like, I'm going to have a different level of trust to believe what I'm reading about you. I'm going to need a lot more information about who you are. Maybe this is why, people are learning about, fake news. It's like, verify your facts first. We're learning we need to do that because it's so easy to substitute. Anyway, not introducing fake news right now. But I love the fact that you said realizing you're working with a human, and that might be really important element there. We're still, we don't evolve very quickly. We don't evolve as fast as technology. And maybe our brains are saying, are you sure? Are you sure that's a person? Because my cat doesn't know me on the phone. When I go away, my cat hears my voice but cannot see my face. Right?
I'm going to try that with my cat. I'm going to phone my cat.
Oh, yeah. She'll know you're there from the voice, but I don't know about dogs if they can recognize video. I'm not sure about dogs, but I like that. Realizing you're working with a human. There's a whole book there. Speaking of books, you wrote and have published this year the phenomenal and seminal and very important book called Network Music Performance Theory and Applications. And I was very honoured to be asked to write on the book jacket. And I said, today's musician works online, yet we haven't even begun to plumb the depths of creative collaboration over the internet. The book illuminates why network music performance is an emerging force. Culture and technology become more sophisticated when driven by both social necessity and the obviously rich rewards of new music and cultural opportunities. Tell me about the book. How did that happen? It's a lot of work.
Yeah, how did it happen? I was at a conference, an online conference during COVID, and someone from Rouslish sent me an email and said, do you fancy writing a book? I thought, oh, no, of course, that's a ridiculous idea. And then I thought about it a little bit more and thought, actually, do you know what, there isn't another book like this, and nobody else is writing one, so why not? I'll do it. It'll be a fun project. So from a very basic level, that's where it came from. But I suppose also the kind of thinking around it was, I've been working with students, since like 2010, I think. No, maybe a bit after that I started doing the network stuff. But there was no textbook around it, and for educators, that's especially at that kind of university level, the first thing you do is like, write resources. What are the resources around this? And there pretty much weren't any. So I was kind of gathering all this information, and so it's a combination of the research from the PhD. It's a combination of the resources that I've gathered over the years, but also I suppose the questions that I got asked during COVID about how do you actually do this from musicians. And there's no quick answer to that, is it? It's not just here you go, have an A4 kind of fact sheet that will get you started. There's so many variables, and there's, as I was saying before, there's that kind of whole spectrum of using your phone to the kind of stuff that you do actually, which requires more of an understanding of the kind of network side of things. So I thought, well, that's the way to do it, put it in a single resource. But then, of course, as you start doing this, you're like, oh, gosh, where do I start? Or where do I stop, I suppose? And I suppose I found that cultural side of it and that idea of networking from the human side of things, that's, I guess, where I find the most interest around it.
Yeah, absolutely. And just the content of the book. So, you go through synchronous network music performance, which is probably mostly what we were talking about today. And then asynchronous performance, which is songwriting, collaborating, asynchronously and using file sharing and those kind of things. Online music teaching, which is another important one. I guess that also involves rehearsals. Maybe that comes to that as well. And accessibility. So I really, plus you go through sound engineering, the available tools, in an abstract way. So the book's going to have a very long life as well. And I felt after reading it that if I had come to this with nothing, I would leave feeling like, okay, I've got a good base of how I can work with network music as an educator or as a musician or as a student. Thank you so much for writing it.
Well, yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for reading it and thank you for reviewing it. It was a big, from an entirely personal point of view, it was a big thing to take on. I'm kind of glad it's over in terms of my free time, but you know what it's like. As soon as there's a vacuum for time, something else fills it. So.
Absolutely, yeah. And what did you feel that you personally got out of all that writing and that research? How did it change your view on the world, network music world?
I think actually it was a big thing was around that gatekeeping idea of actually what does network music performance mean. And I felt quite strongly that the asynchronous stuff did need to come into it, because actually when you start trying to define these things, actually that was a big thing. Like when you have to put something down on paper and sort of like commit to it, trying to actually define what these things mean is really difficult. So if you think, right, okay, well, it's fairly obvious, isn't it? Synchronous, you're working in time with one another. But then you've got latency. So suddenly, actually, it's not actually synchronous. It becomes, if you're kind of being really kind of technical about it, it becomes asynchronous. So at what point, like what's the cutoff point for that? So I've had to, we like to categorize things, don't we? So I've had to sort of say, well, synchronous is where you're effectively working in time with one another, sort of in real-ish time. I think I maybe...
Yeah, I use the word near real time. Is a phrase that we like. It's like you're reacting in your physical real time, but you're receiving the information a little bit delayed. And information, something I really like, is that neurologically, we live in the past. Our brain processes information and then it gets sent to our cognitive functions. But it takes time to do that. And even more, these things there are delays. So music is faster than sight, and the brain delays sound so that it syncs up in our brain with what we're seeing, because it knows the latencies inside our brain, right? Yeah, it's fascinating. And think about this. If you pinch yourself on your ear, you feel it immediately, right? Pinch yourself on your toe, you feel it immediately. But it takes time to travel from your toe. So your brain just says, well, it all happened at the same time. It's nuts what we're doing inside our brain. I worked with this neurologist a little bit, Rebekah, and there's so much interesting information about how the brain manages time and our internal processes. So when we're thinking about latency, I'm like, you know what, half a second latency is nothing. The brain can handle that. I can culturally adjust to that.
And actually, if you look at the research around latency in music, if you ask a chamber musician, for example, because they're very much about their ensemble, how much latency there is, well, there isn't any. But actually there is. There's like 30 milliseconds is considered as a sort of average in terms of the synchronicity, I suppose, between musicians. But yeah, they don't perceive it. So when you then look at kind of latencies around network performance, suddenly it becomes actually, do you know what, 30 milliseconds, that's quite a long time.
Yeah. If you're a brass band on like a football field, right? I mean, that's latency between the tuba and when it's a percussionist, like doesn't percussionists and orchestras like play earlier so that they get it out on time?
Yes, but as a young percussionist, nobody told me that, so I was constantly out of time. I remember I was in a youth orchestra, and the conductor. It's quite a funny story. The conductor's wife taught me. She was a percussion teacher, So he didn't really know many people's names, but he knew my name because I used to go to his house for my lessons. So he would absolutely shout at me as my triangle note was like far too late. But there was someone in the second violins, also called Miriam, and obviously it's not like a hugely common name in the UK. And she was probably like 11 or 12 years old, and he would like absolutely shout Miriam across this orchestra, and she was just in front of me the way we were laid out.
Oh, dear.
And this poor girl was absolutely traumatized by this youth orchestra conductor. And I mean, you seriously hope that would not happen now, but
Not these days. No, the things that happened in the 80s, I think we can leave them there.
But how
Nice.
Yes.
my teacher had never thought to say, or even how I hadn't worked out, because I mean,
Oh, I don't think that's your responsibility as a young musician.
but I know now.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a really great topic to sadly end this conversation. I think we could talk for another hour. So we'll probably just talk again and again in the future and do another chat. We covered a lot here. And yeah, I'm going to package this up nicely so that people can enjoy it. So if you're still listening to this point, so glad that you stayed and heard our stories, and there's going to be a bunch of links available with as well. So thank you so much, Miriam. Really appreciate your time, and the book I have with me, so I'm going to make sure that this is really made, everyone can see how to find it as well. So it's the book.
Source